Good afternoon, and let me begin by thanking the faculty and students of Shiksha Anusandhan University for hosting all of us here. Let me also thank the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Culture, and of course, the Indian Knowledge Systems Project, which has put together this program, and specifically invited me to speak about India's maritime past, a topic which is very close to my heart. I've written books about it, as some of you will know. So the question is, why do we need to come to a place like Odisha and tell you about your maritime past? The reason is that sadly, the way we tell Indian history has been, in recent decades, become essentially told from an entirely landlocked way, almost a Delhi-centric continental view of Indian history. And what it does is that it leaves out this extraordinarily rich history of India which is related to the ocean. And this is sad because, remember, we are literally the only country in the world which has an ocean named after us, the Indian Ocean. And much of that history is linked to this state, as you will see as I tell you this story. Because when you read your history books, I'm sure one of the things you would have wondered is the only time that Odisha shows up in it is when Ashoka comes and carries out a massacre here. You almost get the impression that the people of Odisha were sitting around waiting for Ashoka to come and carry out genocide. And after he left, you had nothing else to do. This is utterly absurd view of history, not just of Odisha, but of the whole country. So I'm going to try and show you how this history looks completely different when seen from a coastal perspective. Now, of course, India, given its shape, much of it is peninsular and therefore linked to the sea. And so from the very, very beginning of our history, we have had a close relationship with the sea. And the earliest evidence of this comes right in the beginning from the Vedic and Bronze Age civilization of Harappa. So, whether it's in the Rig Veda, where we have mention of the sea and the oceans, or from archaeology, you can see the mention of maritime trade. So the earliest clear archaeological evidence of maritime trade comes from Harappan sites, such as Dholavira. Now, if you look up a map, it will see that Dholavira is in Gujarat, and it looks on the map as if it is inland. Actually, if you came to Gujarat 6,000 years ago, you would have seen that the coastline was very different because sea levels were actually higher than what they are today. So what you now know as the Run of Kutch was not salt flats. It was actually the estuary of two major rivers, the Saraswati River and the Indus River. And Dholavira, which now looks like it's inland, marooned in the salt flats of the Run of Kutch, was actually an island, and it was a port. And from here, ships would sail out. Some of them would sail south, because do remember the Saurashtra, because sea levels were higher, was also an island. And so you could go to Lothal from Dholavira, sailing out, and Lothal was actually not a port, which is what is written in our text. It was actually a customs depot. And from there, they would sail down along the Konkan coast and down to the Malabar coast. And you could sail west from Dholavira, past a place called Dwarka. Dwarka literally means the gate. And there is evidence in a place in an island called Bet Dwarka, just off Dwarka, of lots of Harappan ships that used to come there, including the anchors and so on. And they would sail out towards the Persian Gulf. And they would visit Oman and what is now the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and all the way to what is now Iraq, what is then Sumeria. And they would visit the Sumerian cities there. And what would they trade? They would trade in Indian ivory, in peacocks, and cloth, and all kinds of things. So Mesopotamian Sumerian cuneiform tablets tell us the story of Indians who visited there, who the Sumerians called the Meluha people. And they tell us that there were these enclaves, what they call villages, of these Meluhans living in and around these Sumerian towns in what is now Iraq. So when you go to the Middle East and you see these groups of large numbers of Indians living there, do remember that Indians have been living in the Middle East in these enclaves for thousands of years. And much of them were, of course, coming from Gujarat at that point in time. And the earliest evidence of an individual Indian comes from a court case recorded in Sumerian texts. And it talks of an Indian or a Meluhan who was there in a court case in which he had been accused of breaking the tooth of a local in a drunken brawl. So the Meluhan was found guilty and he was fined a bunch of silver coins for having beaten up this local in a drunken brawl. Now who knows, maybe this is the origin of prohibition in Gujarat. Now this universe that I just described came to a sudden stop around about 2000 BC because climate changed and the river Saraswati dried up, sea levels fell, and Dholavira got marooned in the middle of the salt flats. That entire universe got destroyed as those cities based on these rivers were on the river Saraswati fell into disuse because the climate had changed. And the people of there kind of migrated all over. Some went west into Central Asia, some went into the into the Gangetic Plains and so on. So the next round of maritime activity that we see happens not on the west coast but on the east coast, between the westernmost outlet of the Ganga, which is what we now call the Hooghly near Kolkata, that's in Bengal, and the stretching all the way along to Lake Chilika, which is now in Odisha. So this coastline became in the Iron Age the hub of maritime activity, and of course stretching outwards a little bit towards the Andhra coast as well. And from here, merchants began to sail out and began to explore this coastline. Now notice that in the beginning, they did not have the capacity of sailing right across. What they were doing is they were sailing along the coastline. Some of them sailed along the coastline southwards, and they began to explore the island of Sri Lanka. And enough of these people from this Bengal, Odisha area ended up settling in Sri Lanka, so much so that the majority population of Sri Lanka today, the Sinhalese, are of Bengali Odia origin. And their language is Sinhalese, is actually of Bengali Odia, is linked to Bengali and Odia. And there is a very famous story of King Vijaya coming from the kingdom of Vanga, or Bengal, coming and settling there. Now they were also sailing in the other direction as well. So not only were they sailing south, they were sailing along the coast, past the Irivadi and what is now Myanmar, out towards the Malay Peninsula, and there is an isthmus of Kra. This is the bit of Thailand from which Malaysia hangs, the Malay Peninsula hangs. And then from there they crossed over to the other side and sailed out towards Vietnam, what is now the Vietnam and Cambodia, but basically is the Mekong Delta. And so we begin to see by the 5th, 6th century BC some presence of Indians there. And over time they begin to settle there as well. And there's a beautiful story about how this came about, which is told in both Cambodian and Vietnamese legends. And I'm going to tell you this story. Who knows if it's true, but it's very, very important to the founding legends of all these parts of the country. So the story goes as follows. The story is that at some ancient time, who knows when it was, there was an Indian ship captained by a Brahmin called Kaundinya that was sailing along the coast of the Vietnam, Cambodia area, the Mekong Delta, when it was attacked by pirates. And so Kondenya rallied his troops to his crew, and they fought off the pirates. Unfortunately, what happened as a result of this battle at the sea, his ship developed some leaks. So he was forced to take it to the coast and begin to carry out repairs on the beach. So while he was carrying out repairs on the beach, suddenly the local tribe, it was a serpent tribe, a Naga tribe, suddenly surrounded them and threatened to kill them all. And as you can imagine, this was a frightening experience. But nevertheless, Kondenya again rallied his men, and they were going to defend themselves. But it looked quite hopeless. At this stage, however, luck turned in their favor. Because what happened is that the warrior princess of the Naga tribe saw Kondenya and fell in love. And she proposed marriage to him. Now I suppose Kondenya didn't have too much choice at this point. So he agreed to this marriage. And so the warrior princess named Soma, or the moon-faced one, and Kondenya got married, and they set up a kingdom, of the kingdom of Funan. And this started the beginning of Indianization of Southeast Asia. And it starts not with somewhere close by like Indonesia, but far away in southern Vietnam. And this story of Kondenya and Soma's wedding is then talked to the foundation myth of all succeeding dynasties that came to rule that part of the world for the next 1,500 years. Even today, the royal family of Cambodia takes its origins back to this marriage. And this would continue as more and more people from India, merchants from India, spread all over the world. On the eastern side, they would go all the way to Japan, to Korea. In fact, Korean history begins, as taught in their textbooks, with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya in UP. So all of this history is there, very well documented in many places. Sadly, this is not taught in Indian history. So I'm hoping that through this, we are able to tell this story. Now what happens as we move forward into history is that we begin to see more and more maritime trade begin to happen. Some of this happens on the west coast, as merchants from the Kerala, Karnataka coast begin to trade with people along on the outward towards the Romans, the Greeks, the Arabs, and so on. And on the other coast, you begin to see merchants from this coastline, the eastern coastline, which of course importantly includes Kalinga, sailing out further and further out. And this is possible because they begin to learn about the monsoon winds. Why are the monsoon winds important? They're important because it is interesting, because part of the year it flows from south to north, and for the rest of the year it flows from north to south. So it allows merchants using sailboats to sail in one direction for part of the year and in the opposite direction in the other part of the year. Now this is very, very useful if you want to trade, because you want to go somewhere and come back. And this happens on both the coastlines. And so you begin to see a lot of trade begin to happen. And you begin to see merchants sailing out from here, sailing out towards Indonesia. Now, how did they sail to Indonesia? Did they sail directly across? No. Because the way you have to sail when the wind is blowing from the north is actually you have to first sail southward, down towards Sri Lanka, and then sail out eastwards towards Sumatra, and then from Sumatra down south towards Java, and finally to places like Bali. And so much of this trade was happening, and so much of it was part of the culture of this part of the world, that every year you still have a festival, Kartik Purnima, where you commemorate this festival. So this is important. Why does Kartik Purnima happen at this time of the year? It happens because this is the time of the year when the winds turn. So if you go to the coastline, and I have seen it myself on the Chandrabhaga beach near Konark, if you go and stand there at this time of the year, The wind blows from the north. So what is happening when you are celebrating this Kartik Purnima festival? What is happening is effectively you are celebrating the families, the women and children of the merchants coming out to the water body, which is either to the estuary or to the sea itself, and saying goodbye to the menfolk who are going off on these long journeys. So this is what you're seeing. So basically, before the sun rises, in a full moon night, when the wind is blowing from the north, it's an obvious time when the ships would set sail. And that is what you are commemorating. And of course, there are similar such festivals held in other parts of the world. Exactly the same reason. In Thailand, and on exactly the same day, Kartik Purnima, they have something called Loy Krathong, where they do exactly the same thing. They put these boats out to sea, commemorating the time in which these ships would set sail. Now, it is important to know that this is not something that happened out there and has no implications today. Even today, there are many places around the world which commemorate this impact of ancient India and the rest of the world. When you go to Singapore, do remember the name is Singhapura, or just like Udaipur, Jaipur, there's Singapore, i.e. the Lion City. Why is a country called, or a city called Lion City out in Southeast Asia? Because it was named as a result of this huge amount of trade that took Indic culture to these parts of the world. There's a country called Indonesia. It calls itself in 1949, when it became independent country, it named itself after India. Why? Because of the enormous influence of India on those parts of the world. The largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, it's in Cambodia. It's Angkor Wat. So there's enormous influence of India in all these parts of the world. And of course, it is not just culture and trade. It was also geopolitics that was happening at that. So do remember, when you long periods of time, there's a huge amount of geopolitics, trade, interaction that is happening. If you go to Konark Temple, you will also see there is a carving there from the 12th, 13th century of a king who is welcoming a merchant who is giving him a giraffe. So they're going all the way, not just eastward, but also westward to Africa. Now let me tell you that all of this, of course, is not too dissimilar to all the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean that is happening even today. So you went there in the beginning of the 11th century, came to this part of the Indian Ocean in the beginning of the 11th century. Then what was global trade and geopolitics all about? It was basically about the pipelines of trade that was happening between Egypt, where the Fatimid dynasty was ruling, India, where the Cholas were ruling much of the southern India, and China, where the Song Empire was in power. And a lot of trade was going back and forth between them. And this trade was being carried eastward from to China through two straits. One was the Malacca Straits between Java and between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, and the other was happening through the Sunda Straits, which is between Java and Sumatra Islands. Now, typically, the Javans used to control the Sunda Straits, and the Srivijaya kings of Sumatra would control the Malacca Straits. This is how trade worked. But what happened is that with the help and backing of the Chinese, you ended up having both the straits, the Sunda Straits and the Malacca Straits, coming under the control of the Srivijaya kings of Sumatra. Now, as always happens with any monopolist, they began to impose ever higher tariffs on trade between India and China. So now, the king of the Cholas, King Rajendra Chola, got very annoyed by this. So he sent, in 1017, he sent a warning to the kings of Srivijaya to stop this imposition of control on trade. And they didn't listen. So in 1025 AD, a very large fleet set sail from Nagapattinam, sent by the Cholas, and then the Cholas sailed all the way across to Southeast Asia, where they sacked all the Srivijaya ports and finally defeated the Srivijaya army in a place called Kedah, in what is now in Malaysia, and completely destroyed them. As a result of which, again, the port, these shipping lanes got opened up. The reason I'm telling you this story is so that you do remember that when you think about, the Indo-Pacific and the geopolitics of this region, do remember this is nothing new. This has been going on for thousands of years, and the Indians have been part of this geopolitics for a long time. A lot of it had to do with trade, but sometimes it required military intervention. And so I'm very glad that my friends here from the Indian Navy are here to know that they have a very long lineage as well in this part of the world. Now, do remember that all this trade that I'm talking about is not some small numbers of heroic merchants setting sail to go and explore and trade. Maybe in the very beginning you had individual traders like Kaundi doing all of this. But by certainly the 7th, 8th, 9th century, these were corporatized fleets run by these corporatized guilds. Some of them had fanciful names like the 500, which tells you there were 500 shareholders who were funding. This was from southern India. There was a corporatized guild called the 500. There were many others as well. And they would set sail from places like Kalinga, from the Andhra coast, from the Tamil coast. They were very large corporations. They had their own navies. They had their own armies. And in fact, some of the kings used to be quite frightened of these multinational guilds. Also, interestingly, it is interesting to know who used to finance these. It used to be the temples that used to finance these great voyages. And this is important to know. Sometimes some of you may have wondered, why was there so much gold in these ancient medieval Indian temples? Now, sometimes people get the impression that's because, kings who used to build these temples were handing over all their wealth to these temples. Now, let me assure you that even in ancient times, it was very difficult to get Indian politicians to hand over their money to anyone. So the reason there was so much money and gold in the temples is because the temples used to function as banks, and the venture capitalists who were backing all these voyages to faraway lands. And we even today have these copper plate contracts between the artisan guilds, the merchant guilds, and the financiers, the banks, the temple banks, who were financing all these voyages. So this is how for centuries, this entire ecosystem of trade happened. And it continued to carry on even past empires rose and fell, dynasties came and went. But this was such a well-run ecosystem that it continued forever till about the 13th century, when this whole dynamics changed. India was, of course, conquered by waves and waves of Turkic invasions, which happened from the land, not from the sea. But unfortunately, this impacted our hold on the sea because our ports were sacked, but very importantly, our temples were also sacked, which meant that the financial power that used to back all this maritime activity suddenly fell apart. And then, of course, our maritime dominance went into decline. And the Indian Ocean passed into the hands of the Arabs, the Indonesians under the Majapahit, and eventually the Chinese, and finally, of course, the Europeans. Now, before I end, let me say, there is something, however, to be said about remembering this past and revisiting it. This is such a rich past. It is alive today in festivals that you will celebrate. So, there is an interesting experiment that we are going to do, which I need to tell you about. Because we are, as a part of the Indian Knowledge Systems effort, we're going to do this, which is about stitch ships. So let me tell you about the kinds of ships that Indians were using to sail or make all these great voyages. These ships were not like what you may imagine, that they were nailed together into these big ships that later the Europeans were sailing. These ships were actually stitched together using a very unique technique. Now, why did the Indians stitch their ship together rather than nail them to the frames? Well, we don't know for sure. But certainly it wasn't because we didn't know how to make rust-free iron nails. We actually had the technology for rust-free iron nails. We know that from, for example, the Gupta era iron pillar in Delhi. So we had the technology for rust-free nails, but we still didn't use it. For a variety of reasons, we preferred to stitch our ships together, and there are many foreigners who visited India at that time who comment about this. Many of our traditions still continue with this. And this unique style of stitching to build these big ships continued well into the 16th, 17th century, where unfortunately, finally that technology reached its limits because it couldn't deal with cannons, because this style of stitching together ships was unable to deal with the backlash of firing a cannon. So ultimately, this technique fell into disuse. But there were still ships of this kind being built into the early 20th century. And even now, very small fishing vessels are still being built by a few villages and that still remember this technique. Unfortunately, it's rapidly dying out. So as part of that, we have decided to try and attempt a project to try and, while there are still people who remember how this technique works, to try and build a large ship based on an ancient 2,000-year-old ancient ship design, and then, importantly, try and sail it. So we're going to try and sail this ship once we have built it, and there will be a video just after this to show you the kind of ship. But it'll be, as you can imagine, so much fun to sail it on Kartik Purnima from right here in Odisha all the way to Bali. So we are putting this all together, getting all the money sanctioned, etc. But while we are doing this, the Indian Navy very kindly has put together the design and studied it and beginning to test it. Of course, do remember that these ancient ships may have very different sailing characteristics from modern sailing ships as well, because will have more flexible hulls. We'll have to experiment with the different kinds of sails. Technically, in the very early phase, they used to use square sails. Later on, they took lantern sails. All of these have sailing characteristics which we do not know. So we will have to actually build this ship, then actually sail it for a while to figure out how it works. And finally, once we have understood how this works, to then hopefully be able to sail it all the way to Indonesia in a few years' time.